This is lesson number 7 of music theory, and in this lesson we're going to be covering intervals. Intervals. Now, an interval is referring to the distance from one note to another note. For example, the distance from C to D, or G to A, or A flat to D flat, or D flat to G flat, or C to F, G to F, E to D sharp. Each of those intervals has a name, and so we're going to talk about what the names of every type of interval that you will encounter. First of all, let's talk about the difference between harmonic intervals and melodic intervals. Just starting off very basic, harmonic intervals occur when the two notes sound at the exact same time. So for example, if you have a C and a D sounding at the exact same time, that creates a harmonic interval because those two notes are sounding at the exact same time. Melodic interval would be if the notes occur one after the other. So for example, C to D, that's still an interval. There's still a distance between those notes there, but they're not played at the same time. Hence we call it a melodic interval. When you're playing melodies, you're playing individual notes one at a time. Whereas if you're playing harmony, if you're playing chords, you're playing more than one note at the same time. So that's why we call one of them a harmonic interval and the other a melodic interval. Now, starting off with all these intervals I have listed right here, we've got unison, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and an octave. These intervals are found within a major scale. All of those intervals that we just named are found within any of the 12 major scales. So in this example right here, I've got the C major scale written out right here. If you notice right here, we've got C right here. We've got a D listed right here. We've got an E up here. F, G, A, B, and C. So those notes form the C major scale. But I also keep C on the bottom for all of these intervals because I want to talk about what the distance is from the bottom note of the scale to every other note in the scale. So what's the interval from C to C? What's the interval from C to D? C to E? C to F? C to G? C to A? C to B? C to C? So each one of those intervals has a name. And let's first of all start with the unison. Now the unison is just referring to the exact same note. Often in a hymn, you'll see soprano and alto notes converging into one note. And sometimes even tenor and bass, they'll converge and they'll be singing the same exact note. Now moving on to the next one, we've got a C and a D. I've got a C and a D in the bass clef and a C and a D also in the treble clef. That distance is a major second. Now there are two components to naming intervals that we will talk about. First of all, you have the size of the interval, which is indicated by a number. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And you also have what is called the interval quality, the quality of the interval. So for example, in this case, we have capital M's, which indicate major intervals. Major because they are found within a major scale. You also have minor intervals. You have augmented intervals, diminished intervals, and perfect intervals, as indicated by the P there. You have perfect intervals right there, a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth. First of all, let's talk about the size of the interval. This one is a second because it spans two different letter names in the musical alphabet. C to D. It spans two note names. This one is a third because it spans three different notes. C, D, and E. There in the treble clef too, we got C, D, and E. We count the first one as well as the top one. So C, counting C, and then D, that's number 2, and then E is number 3. So that is a third. It's a distance of a third. This one is a fourth because it spans C, D, E, and F. C, D, E, and F. This one is a fifth because it spans C, D, E, F, and G. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Sixth, of course. And then a seventh right here. And then an eighth. Or an octave. We call that an octave. And then we also have the interval quality. Now in this case right here, I've got a major second. It's a major second because that C to D occurs within a C major scale. So the next note in a C major scale is D after C. So C to D is an interval of a second, but we also call it a major second. C to E is a third, and because it is a third that we find in a major scale, we call it a major third. And then moving on to C to F. C to F, we don't call that a major fourth. We actually call it a perfect fourth. So that's actually called a perfect fourth. C to G is called a perfect fifth. C to A is called a major sixth. C to B is a major seventh. And then C to C is an octave. Of course, we know that from talking about octaves in previous lessons. One C to the next C up is the distance of an octave. Now, moving on to minor intervals. Minor intervals are 1/2 steps smaller than major intervals. If we remember, the distance from C to D is a major second. If we lower that D by a 1/2 step and call it D flat, we will get a minor second. Minor because it's just 1/2 step lower than its major second. C to D is a major second. C to D flat is a minor second. C to E is a major third. And if we lower that E by a 1/2 step, C to E flat, we get a minor third. And then C to A is a major sixth. Lower that A by a 1/2 step, and you get a minor sixth. So C to A flat is a minor sixth. C to B was our major seventh. And if we lower that B by a 1/2 step, we'll get a minor seventh. C to B flat. So here's what all of these minor intervals sound like after playing the major interval. C to D is the major second, and then C to D flat is the minor second. So C to D, C to D flat, that's the minor second there. And then C to E is our major third. What if we lower that E down a 1/2 step? We get the minor third. C to E flat is our minor third. And then C to A is our major sixth. What if we lower that A by a 1/2 step? C to A flat, we get our minor sixth. And then C to B is our major seventh. Let's lower that B by a 1/2 step. We get C to B flat, and we call that a minor seventh. One thing that's important to remember when you're transferring major intervals to minor intervals is that the note head will be placed on the same line or space as the major version of that interval. So right here we've got C to D. C to D flat is our minor second. We keep that D flat on the same space as this D right here. We just add one flat to it. You wouldn't want to put that as a C sharp because then it would be placed on the same line as the C, and it would no longer be the interval of a second because it's only spanning one different letter name. So you want to have, in order for it to be a minor second, it has to span two different letter names, C and D, but it has to have that flat on the second note. And the same thing applies for each of these intervals, the minor third, the minor sixth, and the minor seventh. We keep the note head on the same line or space as the major alternative. So here we've got the note head on the same space. Here we've got the note head on the same line right here. It's on the same A line on the bass clef staff. And then this one right here is on the same space right here. It's above that top line there. We've just added a flat. You wouldn't want to write this note as a D sharp. You wouldn't want to write this note as a G sharp. And you wouldn't want to write this note as an A sharp. Although those are enharmonic equivalents, they would no longer be the distance of a third, a sixth, or a seventh, because they would no longer span the same amount of lines or spaces, or the same amount of letter names within the musical alphabet. So just remember, whenever you're transferring a major interval to a minor interval, write it on the same line or space as the major alternative. And keep that same starting letter in your note name. So E, E flat, A flat, B flat. Moving on to augmented intervals. Augmented intervals are 1/2 step larger than major or perfect intervals. And I have the 4 most common augmented intervals colored in orange right here. C to D is a major second, if we remember. But if we add a sharp sign to that D, then we'll increase it to an augmented interval. So C to D, that was our major second. But what if we play, instead of a D, we play it a D sharp, C to D sharp? That is an augmented second. It's still a second because it's spanning 2 different letter names, but it's augmented because it's 1/2 step larger than a major second. You can also have an augmented third, an augmented fourth, augmented fifth, augmented sixth, augmented seventh, as well as an augmented octave and an augmented unison, although those are not very common. Octaves and unisons are also perfect intervals, so you can augment those as well. So our augmented unison right here, if we remember, our unison was just C to C, but what if we augment that second C with a sharp sign, C to C sharp? We call that an augmented unison. And we put a plus symbol to indicate the augmented. So C to C sharp is a unison. The size is still a unison because it's spanning just one letter name in the alphabet. But that next C is sharp, so we call it an augmented unison. C to C sharp. And we talked about C to D sharp right there. C to E sharp. And if we remember, C to E is a major third. If we put a sharp sign on that E, we'll get an augmented third. So C to E was our major third. If we bring that E up a 1/2 step, we get an augmented third. Although that's not very common, it's still an interval that we'll talk about. And then our augmented fourth right here. This is a very common interval that we will encounter. If we remember, our perfect fourth was C to F. But if we put a sharp sign on that F, we get C to F sharp. So C to F is our perfect fourth. C to F sharp is our augmented fourth. And that is a really common interval that we will encounter when we go to write out chords. And then we have an augmented fifth, also a very common interval. If we remember, our perfect fifth was C to G. But what if we raise that G by a 1/2 step? C to G sharp. That's called an augmented fifth. And then we have an augmented sixth right here. If you remember our major sixth, it was C to A. But let's put the A up a 1/2 step. C to A sharp now is our augmented sixth. And then moving on to our augmented seventh, although the augmented seventh almost never occurs. C to B was our major seventh. But if we raise that B by a 1/2 step, we get C to B sharp. which is our augmented seventh. Not to be confused with an octave. Although B sharp and C natural are enharmonic equivalents, we call it an augmented seventh because it's just spanning 7 different letter names. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So it's a seventh for sure because it's the note B, but because we've raised it a half step, it's an augmented seventh. And then talking about our augmented octave, we can also augment the octave. C to C is our octave, but if we add a sharp sign on that C, we get an augmented octave. The ones that you really need to pay attention to are the ones colored in orange, because these are the ones that you will encounter when you go to write out chords. So the augmented second, augmented fourth, augmented fifth, and the augmented sixth. They are just major or perfect intervals raised 1/2 step. So C to D, raise that D to a D sharp. C to F, raise that F to an F sharp. C to G, raise that G to a G sharp. C to A, raise that A to an A sharp. And you get your augmented intervals. Diminished intervals are 1/2 steps smaller than minor or perfect intervals. So augmented intervals were 1/2 step larger than major or perfect intervals. Diminished intervals are 1/2 step smaller than minor or perfect intervals. So let's go through these diminished intervals here. And once again, I have the most common diminished intervals colored in brown. There's really only 2 different types of diminished intervals that you'll see very often, and that's the diminished fifth and the diminished seventh. But let's start all the way over here at the diminished second. If we remember, C to D was our major second, but then we took the D and lowered it by a 1/2 step to get our minor second. So C to D flat was our minor second. But in order to make this a diminished interval, we need to take that minor second and lower that by 1 more 1/2 step. So it's no longer C to D flat, it's C to D double flat. So C to D double flat would be a diminished second. C to C double flat, that's a diminished interval, and it's enharmonically the same note. D double flat and C natural are enharmonic equivalents. But for the sake of this lesson, we're going to talk about even the extremely rare ones. You also have a diminished third. If we remember, our major third was C to E. C to E. But to make our minor third, we put a flat sign on the E. In order to make it a diminished interval, we'll need to put another flat sign and lower it by another 1/2 step to get to our diminished third. So C to E double flat is our diminished third. And then our diminished fourth right here. If we remember our perfect fourth, because diminished intervals are 1/2 step smaller than minor or perfect intervals, so it'll be 1/2 step smaller than a perfect fourth. Our perfect fourth was C to F, but let's put a flat sign on that F. That gives us C to F flat, C to F flat. Sounds like a major third, but if you write it as an F flat instead of an E natural, it's actually called a diminished fourth. It's a fourth because it's spanning 4 different letter names, C, D, E, and F, but it's diminished because you're taking that perfect interval and lowering it by a 1/2 step. Now moving on to diminished fifths. These are the ones that you really need to pay attention to, diminished fifths and diminished sevenths, because you will start to see these when you go to write out chords. C to G, if you remember, that was our perfect fifth, C to G, but let's add a flat to that G. That gives us C to G flat. That's a diminished fifth. And the 0 right here, the small 0 right there, that's the symbol for a diminished. So that's a diminished symbol. I've got the diminished symbol on each of these intervals right here. Moving on to our diminished sixth. What's our major sixth? C to A. But when we take that major sixth and put a flat sign on that A, we get a minor sixth. But in order to make it a diminished interval, we need to lower that A flat by another half step. So we'll put 2 flats on that A. C to A double flat is a diminished sixth. And then our diminished seventh. Once again, this is a really common one that you will see. If you remember, our major seventh was C to B. And then we put a flat sign on that B to make it a minor seventh. But if we put another flat sign on that B double flat, that will give us our diminished seventh. And then we also have a diminished octave. Although extremely rare, we'll talk about it. C to C, if you remember, was our octave. And a diminished interval is 1/2 step smaller than a perfect interval. An octave is a perfect interval. So if we lower that C by a half step, C to C flat, not a B natural, but C to C flat, that is a diminished octave. So that covers major intervals, minor intervals, augmented intervals, diminished intervals, and perfect intervals. Just a brief recap on each one. We can have major seconds, major thirds, major sixths, and major sevenths. A major second is the distance from the first note in a major scale to the second note in a major scale. A major third is the distance from the first note of a major scale to the third note of a major scale. These can be any major scales. A major sixth is the distance from the first note of a major scale to the sixth note of a major scale. A major seventh is the distance from the first note of a major scale to the seventh note of a major scale. And then our perfect fourth and our perfect fifth, that's the distance from the first note of the major scale to the fourth note of the major scale, and then the first note to the fifth note of a major scale. And then we also have unisons and octaves. C to C is a unison. It's the same exact note. And then C to C up 1 octave, that's the distance of an octave. And of course, we've talked about octaves in previous videos as well. And then to get our minor intervals, we took the major second, major third, major sixth, and major seventh and lowered them by a half step. You're not going to have any minor fourths or minor fifths or minor unisons or minor octaves. You're only going to have minor intervals that are derivatives of the major intervals. So the major intervals such as the second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh, you can turn all of those into minor intervals by lowering the top note by a half step. So C to D flat was our minor second. We just took that D and lowered it by a half step. C to E flat is a minor third. C to A flat is a minor sixth. And C to B flat is a minor seventh. And then augmented intervals are 1/2 step larger than major or perfect intervals. So we talked about an augmented unison. Our unison was C to C, but if we add a sharp sign on that C, we get an augmented unison. C to D was our major second. If we add a sharp sign to that D, we get an augmented second. And so on for every interval. And diminished intervals are 1/2 steps smaller than minor or perfect intervals. So once you've determined what the minor intervals are, if you take the minor intervals and just add 1 flat to the top note, that will give you a diminished interval. So C to D double flat, C to D double flat would be a diminished interval. C to E double flat would be our diminished third. C to F was our perfect fourth, but we added a flat sign to that, so we get our diminished fourth. C to G was our perfect fifth. We add a flat sign to the G to get our diminished fifth. C to A was our major sixth, but we added a flat sign to the A to get a minor sixth, and then we add another flat sign to that A to get a diminished sixth. And the same steps apply for all of these diminished intervals. So that takes care of all of the interval types that you will encounter. Now, for all of these intervals that we talked about, C was our bottom note in every one of these intervals. I have a chart that I've made right here for all of the different types of intervals that you will encounter, but I've got it listed out for every different starting pitch that you can have. So this one has a starting pitch of C, which is what we've already talked about. So C in this first column is our starting pitch. And then in our second column right here, we have C, D flat, D, D sharp, E flat, E, F, F sharp, G flat, G, G sharp, A flat, A sharp, B double flat, B, and C. And I also have it for every other starting pitch. So the note up here in bold is the starting pitch. And the second note of the column is the other notes that you're going to. So starting right here at this first table right here, we've got C as the starting pitch of every interval. And highlighted in green, we have every interval found in a major scale. So if you look at the second note, if you look down this column and look at all of the boxes highlighted in green, we get the notes of a major scale: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. That's our major scale. And then in blue, we have the minor intervals. So D flat is a minor second, E flat is a minor third, A flat is our minor sixth, and B flat was our minor seventh. Minor intervals are just major intervals lowered by a half step. So before every major interval in the chart, so major interval right there, major interval right there, major interval right there, and a major interval right there, before every major interval in this chart, you will see a minor interval. And also, I've got the 4 most common augmented intervals and the 2 most common diminished intervals listed in this chart as well. So the 2 most common diminished intervals are the diminished 5th and the diminished 7th. And the 4 most common augmented intervals are also listed on this chart: the augmented 2nd, augmented 4th, augmented 5th, augmented 6th. Another detail about this chart is for each of these intervals, I have the number of half steps that each interval goes up listed on this side right here. So C to C is 0 half steps because it is the same note. C to D flat goes up 1 half step, so I have it listed as 1 right here on the chart. C to D is 2 half steps. C to D sharp is 3 half steps, and so on down the chart. All the way up to C, that's 12 half steps. Obviously, we know there are 12 half steps within 1 octave. So C to C is 12 half steps. I've got each interval from small all the way up to large, from unison all the way up to an octave. I've got each interval listed out in order of size. So C to C, C to D flat, C to D, C to D sharp, C to E flat, C to E, C to F sharp, C to G flat, C to G, C to G sharp, C to A flat, C to A sharp, C to B double flat, C to B flat, C to B, and C to C. I want to go on and talk about some of the other charts here because the only difference is the major scale that you start with to derive all your other intervals from. In order to talk about intervals that start on other notes, we need to first of all start with our major scale. So in this case, our E flat starting note, if we start our intervals on E flat, to get every interval name correct, we need to have the right spelling of our E flat major scale. So all of these boxes colored in green are the notes of our E flat major scale. We've got E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D, and E flat. For more information about how to build a major scale and how to choose the right note names, you can watch the lesson number 3, the major scales video. But we will start with all of these green boxes right here. E flat to E flat, E flat to F, E flat to G, E flat to A flat, E flat to B flat, E flat to C, E flat to D, and E flat to E flat. E flat to E flat is a unison because it's the same note. E flat to F, going up one note in the major scale. It's a second because it spans two different letter names, E and F. But we call it a major second because it is a second that is found within the major scale. E flat to F. F is the second note of the major scale, so we call that a major second. E flat to G, that's another major interval, and it's a major third, in fact. E flat, F, and G. So that spans three different letter names, so it's called a third. But it's a major third because it's found within an E flat major scale. And then E flat to A flat is our perfect fourth. E flat to B flat is our perfect fifth. E flat to C is our major sixth. E flat to D is our major seventh. E flat to E flat is our perfect octave. And then remember, to get our minor intervals, we take the major intervals and lower them by a half step. So F down a half step would be F flat. So E flat to F flat is our minor second. E flat to G flat is our minor third because we're just taking that major third right there, E flat to G, and lowering that G down a half step. So that gives us our minor third. E flat to C flat is our minor sixth because we're just taking that C and lowering it by a half step. So E flat to C. C is the sixth note in the major scale, so we call it a major sixth. And if we lower that C down a half step, we get E flat to C flat, and that's our minor sixth. And then E flat to D. D is the seventh note of the major scale, so we call it a major seventh. If we lower D by a half step, we get D flat. So E flat to D flat is our minor seventh. And then in order to get our augmented intervals, remember, an augmented interval is a half step larger than a major or perfect interval. I've only got the four most common augmented intervals listed on this chart here. So E flat to F sharp is an augmented interval. All we've done is we've taken E flat to F, which is our major second, and raised the F to an F sharp. So that becomes our augmented second. Remember, you don't want to put that as a G flat. Although G flat and F sharp are enharmonic equivalents, E flat to G flat is a minor third. E flat to F sharp, on the other hand, is an augmented second. So enharmonically, they're the same interval, but because they're spelled differently, they have a different spelling, that gives them a different interval quality and distance. So an augmented second sounds the same as a minor third, but because we spell it as an F sharp instead of a G flat, that's where the different interval comes in. E flat to A, moving on to our next augmented interval. If you remember, our perfect fourth in our E flat major scale was E flat to A flat, and then we raise that perfect interval up a half step, we get to A. So E flat to A is our augmented fourth, and then E flat to B is our augmented fifth. All we've done is we've taken that perfect fifth, E flat to B flat, and we've raised that B flat up a half step. So B flat up a half step. Essentially all you're doing is taking that flat sign away. So E flat to B is our augmented fifth. And then E flat to C sharp is our augmented sixth. You're taking that C, which is the sixth note of the major scale. You're taking that major sixth interval and raising that C up a half step. So E flat to C sharp is your augmented sixth. And then your diminished intervals. There's only two really common diminished intervals, and that is the diminished fifth and the diminished seventh. To get our diminished fifth, we'll take a perfect interval and lower it by a half step. So E flat to B flat was our perfect fifth. Put another flat sign on that B, B double flat, and you'll get a diminished fifth. And in fact, a diminished fifth and an augmented fourth are enharmonic equivalents because A and B double flat are enharmonic equivalents. E flat to A and E flat to B double flat are the same intervals, enharmonic equivalents, of course, and they both span 6 half steps, so they both have 6 half steps they're spanning. You'll find that augmented fourths and diminished fifths come up really often when you go to write out chords. And then also, we have a diminished seventh. A diminished interval is a half step lower than a minor interval or a perfect interval. In this case, we've got our minor interval listed right here. E flat to D flat is our minor seventh. If we add another flat sign to that minor seventh interval, we get E flat to D double flat. And that is our diminished seventh. So I have charts listed out for every different starting pitch. Just remember to get all of the green boxes first. To write out all the green boxes, you will take the notes of the major scale that the starting pitch is. So this note is, the starting note is an E. So you will write out your E major scale to get all of these boxes here. E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, and E. We'll walk through one more chart right here. If we want to start an interval on the note E, our first note will be E for all of these intervals. To get all of your green boxes, which green is your major and perfect intervals, your second note will be E, F sharp, just all the notes of the E major scale. E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, and E. So E to E is your perfect unison. E to F sharp is your major second, because that's the second note of the major scale. E to G sharp is your major third. E to A is your perfect fourth. And E to B is your perfect fifth. And then E to C sharp is your major sixth. And then E to D sharp is your major seventh. E to E is your perfect octave. If we lower our major intervals by a half step, we get to our minor intervals. So lower D sharp to D, lower C sharp to C, lower G sharp to G, and lower F sharp to F. You get all your minor intervals. To get all your augmented intervals, you'll take a major interval or a perfect interval and raise it by a half step. E to F sharp was our major second. If we raise that F sharp up a half step, we get to F double sharp, as indicated by the X right here. F double sharp. That's the best double sharp symbol I can do right here in this chart. And then E to A sharp is our augmented fourth. We're taking our perfect fourth and raising it up a half step, so that A becomes an A sharp. The perfect fifth, E to B, that B will become a B sharp to get our augmented fifth. And then E to C sharp is our major sixth, but we'll take that C sharp and raise it up a half step to get our augmented sixth. So E to C double sharp is our augmented sixth. And to get our diminished intervals, we'll take a perfect interval or a minor interval and lower them by a half step. So our diminished fifth is E to B flat. All we've done is taken the B from our perfect fifth and lowered it by a half step to get our diminished fifth. And then to get a diminished seventh, what we'll do is we'll lower the minor seventh. E to D is our minor seventh. We'll lower that D by a half step to get our diminished seventh. And I have all the charts listed right here for every starting pitch. And this will be a handy tool that you can reference for future videos. And this will provide us a good foundation for when we go to start building chords. Now there's one more thing I'd like to go over before ending the video, and that is how to invert an interval. Inverting an interval. So let's say we have the interval of a minor second, and on this page right here, the interval I have right here, a minor second, I've used the notes C and D flat, just for an example of a minor second. C to D flat. Obviously we know C to D is the major second, but if we lower the second by a half step, we get a minor second. Now, to invert an interval, what we need to do is raise the bottom note of the interval. So in this case, the bottom note is C. Let's take that C up an octave. Now, the C is above the D flat. So D flat to C. We know that's a seventh because it spans 7 letters in the alphabet. D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. And then we know because of our D flat major scale that C is the 7th note of the D flat major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now we've taken that minor second and inverted it to a major seventh by taking that C and raising it up an octave. Let's do the same thing with the major second. Let's see what the major second inverts to. The major second is C to D. Let's take that C up an octave. Now we have D to C. C is a minor seventh above D. C sharp would be the major seventh, but then we lower it down to C. That's the minor seventh. So a major second inverts to a minor seventh. And in fact, major intervals will always invert to minor intervals, and minor intervals will always invert to major intervals. So you see right here, I've got a minor third. It inverts to a major sixth. A major third inverts to a minor sixth. A minor sixth inverts to a major third. A major sixth inverts to a minor third. A minor seventh inverts to a major second. A major seventh inverts to a minor second. These are tongue twisters. But anyways, minor intervals and major intervals always invert one to the other. And another thing is the intervals add up to 9. So 2 plus 7 is 9. 3 plus 6 is 9. And then 7 plus 2 is 9. So minor intervals always invert to major intervals, and the two numbers add up to 9. So if you have a minor sixth and you want to figure out what a minor sixth inverts to, all you have to do is subtract 6 from 9 and then move minor to major, and then you have a major third. If you want to figure out what the inversion of a major seventh is, you just change major to minor, and then 7 plus 2 equals 9. So you always know that a major seventh inverts to a minor second. Also, augmented intervals and diminished intervals are also inversions of each other. Just like major and minor were inversions of each other, augmented intervals will always invert to diminished intervals. And they also add up to 9 as well. So 4 plus 5 and 5 plus 4. An augmented fourth will always invert to a diminished fifth, and a diminished fifth will always invert to an augmented fourth. An augmented fifth will invert to a diminished fourth. An augmented sixth will invert to a diminished third. Diminished seventh will always invert to an augmented second. And an augmented second will always invert to a diminished seventh. So augmented and diminished intervals are inversions of each other. And then they also equal 9. The two intervals add up to 9. Let's go through a couple augmented and diminished intervals. So let's start with this one right here. The augmented fourth to diminished fifth. Let's take our augmented fourth, C to F sharp, C to F sharp. C to F, if we remember, was our perfect fourth. But if we augment the fourth, it turns into an F sharp. So C to F sharp was our augmented fourth. What if we take that C up an octave? Well, now what we have from an F sharp to C, that's a fifth because it spans 5 letter names, F, G, A, B, C. But it's a diminished fifth because you take the perfect fifth and lower it by a half step. A perfect fifth above F sharp is C sharp. C sharp is the fifth note in the F sharp major scale. And if we lower the C sharp by a half step, that gives us our diminished fifth. So C to F sharp was our augmented fourth. But if we move that C up an octave, that gives us a diminished fifth. And the same thing works with the diminished fifth to augmented fourth. They invert back to each other. C to G flat is a diminished fifth because you're taking that perfect fifth, C to G, and lowering it by a half step. But what if we take that C and bring it up an octave? Now we have G flat to C. We know that any kind of G to any kind of C is automatically a fourth because you're spanning 4 letter names, G, A, B, and C. But we know that it's an augmented fourth specifically because the perfect fourth above G flat is C flat. But if we raise C flat up a half step, we get to C. G flat to C is our augmented fourth. And also we have perfect intervals as well. The thing about perfect intervals, and the reason they're called perfect intervals, is because when you invert a perfect interval, you get another perfect interval. So let's take C to F. C to F. F is the fourth note of the C major scale, and we call that a perfect fourth. We don't call it a major fourth, and this is why. It's because when we invert a perfect fourth, we get another perfect interval, which is a perfect fifth. C, D, E, F, that's our perfect fourth. But let's take that C and raise it up an octave. Now we have F to C. C is the fifth note in the F major scale. F, G, A, B flat, C. Therefore, F to C is our perfect fifth. So perfect fourths will always invert to perfect fifths, and perfect fifths will always invert to perfect fourths. And 4 plus 5 is 9, so the intervals will also add up to 9. Let's go through this inversion as well, just to show how perfect fifths can also invert to perfect fourths. So a perfect fifth above C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is G. C to G. G is the fifth note of the C major scale. But let's take that C and raise it up an octave. We have G to C. C is the fourth note in the G major scale. Therefore, it is a perfect fourth. So C to G was our perfect fifth. Then we raised the C up an octave, and it became a perfect fourth. So perfect fifths and perfect fourths are inversions of each other. And it works the same way with octaves and unisons. So a unison, if we remember, is just C to C. But let's take one of those C's and raise it up an octave. Now we have an octave. And this also adds up to 9 because an octave is 8 and the unison is 1 because it's just one letter name. So 1 to 8 adds up to 9. And it also works with octave to unison. So an octave is this C to C. But let's take this bottom C and raise it up an octave. Now we have two of the same C's in unison. And 8 plus 1 is 9. So to review, every minor interval always inverts to a major interval and vice versa. Every augmented interval always inverts to a diminished interval and vice versa. And every perfect interval always inverts to another perfect interval. And the sum of the two interval sizes will always be 9. So 2 plus 7, 3 plus 6, 4 plus 5, 6 plus 3, 7 plus 2, 8 plus 1. And of course, we used C as our primary note to stack intervals on for this example, just because C is a really home base, easy to work with key. But this could work with any starting pitch. As long as it's a minor third will always invert to a major sixth. It doesn't matter if it's A to C. A to C will always invert to a major sixth. Or maybe it's a G to B flat. G to B flat is also a minor third. Let's take that G and raise it up an octave. That's a major sixth. B flat to G. G is the sixth note in the B flat major scale. So these work with any starting pitch. And once again, learning all your intervals will help you when going to build chords in future videos. And there will be a lot of videos on chords because it is a big subject to talk about.